Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending when you're listening to this, and welcome to the first episode of Tax in the Spotlight. For anyone who doesn't know, I'm Pete Hackleton, the head of the sports and entertainment team at Safri. And in our initial episode, I'm joined by Dave Lloyd, a tax senior manager who specialises in football matters, working with me on many of our biggest clients. Today, we're going to explore the world of football agent fees, and particularly the potential tax issues involved.
Striking the right deal in football can be life-changing, and being an agent for some of football's biggest stars can mean negotiating large transfer fees and huge commissions. But these sums can also lead to significant tax implications for the players themselves. So first of all, Dave, good to have you here. How are you feeling?
Very good, thank you, mate. Very good. Excited to get the first S&E podcast out there.
Ready to be grilled?
Absolutely, always.
Okay, before we get on to some of the difficult questions, it might be worth me just giving a very high-level summary of how transfers typically work, and then I can put you on the spot a little bit. So just for everyone's awareness, on almost all transfers that happen in football, the agent will agree the fee, and usually it will be a tripartite agreement. That's between the agent, the club, and the player. And the agreement will be that the club will pay that fee in full, and some of the services will have been provided to the club, and some will have been provided to the player. There are very different treatments of those two fees. So if it's a payment to the club will simply pay the fee. It'll be tax deductible. They'll recover the VAT, and that's the end of the matter. However, for player services, there are a number of tax implications. The first, the club can't recover the VAT, so that adds 20% cost to the deal.
The club will have to pay employers' national insurance on the VAT inclusive amount. And as we know, the employer's NI rate's currently 13.8%, but rising to 15% from the 6th of April 2025. So that's another additional cost. Then there's income tax for the player on the player services element, inclusive of VAT. So, for example, if the player services fee is 500k, the benefit in kind, including VAT, is 600,000. And then another 100,000-ish of employers' NI. The player's got 45% tax to pay on 600,000, so 270k. And all of a sudden you can see that there's a huge additional cost here, and that's really the crux of the issue.
When I go back to my initial work in this area from around 2008, there was a proposal to try and stop the practice of deal representation. That's where the agent acts for both the club and the player on the deal. The FA tried to prohibit it, the agents complained and threatened court, and ultimately that didn't happen. And in reality, there is always an element of the agent acting for both the player they represent and the club who want to sign the player. That's the reality. Since 2008, probably for around 10 years, HMRC's view was that there were three types of deal. Either the agent was acting for the club, the agent was acting for the player, or the agent was acting for both. And if they acted for both, HMRC were quite happy to accept a 50-50 split on those fees. And so that's where we were, all the way up until about 2017-18, when we started to get some inquiries. And what were they saying on those, Dave?
So HMRC, somewhat out of the blue, changed their tact on this. So traditionally you might see, for example, 5% agents fee split 50-50, so 2.5% club, 2.5% player services. And on the side, you'll normally have a player representation agreement of 5%. Traditionally, that was fine, as we and the Premier League kind of expected. But HMRC started to argue that the player should be taxed on the amount that he is due to pay the agent through the rep agreement, so the full 5%. We made the case that the tripartite is a variation of that rep agreement, and that's what follows, but HMRC weren't happy with that, didn't agree. And there was a multitude of inquiries that came our way during that period, a few of which, HMRC did find some evidence, normally some sort of email trail from years gone by, whereby they were pushing for tribunal. And there were some cases where HMRC had some evidence, so some emails from years gone by, where they were pushing quite hard on their case and potentially going to tribunal, and we conceded on those. But there were a significant number where HMRC didn't have any evidence, and quite often were conceding from their side because the onus was on them to prove the transaction otherwise.
Yeah, it felt quite strange at the time, didn't it? Because they'd accepted, as I said, for nearly 10 years, they just seemed to accept that 50-50 split. And they said, if the agent has genuinely provided services to both parties, we will accept a split of 50-50. But all of a sudden, they weren't doing that anymore. And that led us to some quite significant uncertainty when we were advising players, didn't it?
It made it quite difficult for those few years on deals that were happening every January and summer on what's best practice to advise clients. But it was clear from, I think, HMRC, and looking into the new guidance that they've brought out now, you could see the line that HMRC were starting to take in terms of the player representation agreement and what they expect to see. and every single inquiry that we had was asking for evidence.
Yeah.
Which obviously the historic expectation was that there was no need to keep evidence, contrary to HMRC's opinion. So it did create some uncertainty, but that's all changed.
It did, and we'll come on to the new guidance shortly. And I mean, I think that point's a really good one. What changed was that requirement to keep evidence, and we spoke with both the Premier League and certain clubs around that time, and some of the clubs had emails from inspectors who sadly had retired by this point from Inland Revenue, as was now HMRC, where they made it very clear that there was no requirement for clubs to keep evidence as long as the agent acted for both parties. A 50-50 split was fine. So what changed? What happened when the new guidance was introduced?
Well, I won't go through in detail and the guidance. I'm sure we'll post some links alongside the podcast. But the basic remit was that, along the theme of those inquiries that we saw, was that HMRC do not accept and have never, in fact, accepted 50-50 as a basic standpoint. Apart from that, it was just all about the expectation that contemporaneous evidence should be kept to justify the commercial rationale for the split of agents' fees going forward. So if that's 50-50, that might be suitable in that case, but you need to have some sort of evidence to justify that. They issued some further guidance for compliance in May 2024, which again was very much just an emphasis on this evidence point. What the evidence could be, it could be meeting notes, telephone calls, emails, and whilst not referred to in the guidance, we've seen them ask for it in various inquiries, is WhatsApps. Obviously, the way technology goes in life now, WhatsApp's a pretty common communication medium, so that can be relevant, and we've seen HMRC request details of that. The difficulty is, of course, a lot of people delete their WhatsApp history, or they don't have notes of those telephone calls, and they don't have notes of those meetings, which is where the difficulties come.
Yeah, it always amuses me in those HMRC guidance notes when they don't specifically ask for WhatsApps, but they do ask for faxes. I'm not sure that many people send faxes anymore. But no, you're right. You made a really good point there, which I missed earlier, which was that HMRC said that they've never accepted a 50-50 split. That's not in writing anyway, but for many years they did accept that, and I've seen it in a few emails. So that was a difficulty in resolving some of those old inquiries. The new rules came in, as you said, March 2021, they were announced. So was there any kind of specific guidance in there that HMRC gave around getting deals done? Anything that can be helpful for clubs when they're documenting these deals?
I mean, the guidance, there was two separate sections to the guidance, one for setting out their clear risk indicators, which we'll get onto in due course, and another one for the records which all parties to the transaction would be expected to keep, be that the club, be that the player, be that the agent. So that, I feel like that created quite a clear framework on what they would expect. It was just some of the content of their approach to some of these things. So, for example, in trying to attribute value of the services an agent provided, referred to time spent, which can be a little naive to how the football industry works, in that a player might spend 1 hour on a deal, but get a player of £50 million of value to a particular club. Now, you might say £50 million an hour as a salary is quite excessive, but you need to take a holistic approach and look at the bigger picture here in terms of what work has the agent actually achieved in whatever the time frame is, whether it's an hour, whether it's 3 weeks. Look at the asset that he secured the club, or look at the deal he's done for the player, the salary increase or whatever. So you need to have a bit more of a holistic approach to that, as opposed to a kind of narrow-minded, he's only spent 1 hour and he's got £3 million or whatever.
Yeah.
The other element was their further guidance in May 24. They referred to concerns about all documents being signed on the same day, and therefore how can an agent be working for the club if he's only signed a deal with them on the day that the deal was done? In reality, deals are negotiated over days, weeks, or even months, and it's only really when the deal sheet's at a pretty final stage will the club, the legal team, start to draft all the documents that need signing. So the contract, tripartite, rep agreements, sub-rep agreements, whatever it may be. So just, it shows a few disconnects between HMRC and how the industry works. But I'd say on the whole, the guidance has been pretty helpful and has set a pretty decent remit for how the industry should look going forward.
That's excellent. So I think you mentioned just now some of the key risk factors that are set out in the new guidance. Shall we move on to those? And what do you think the main ones are in there?
So I think there are seven key risk factors, a couple of which are connected, but the main two are that the representation agreement. The main piece is that the player services element of the agent's fees are in line with the representation agreement. So if the representation agreement says 5%, then player services on the deal should be 5%. And the other big part, which is becoming ever common in the industry, is the use of family members as intermediaries. We've seen this even going back to the old inquiries 7-8 years ago, that HMRC tend to deem any services provided by a family member to be player services, which they've been pretty strong on. There are exceptions to that, but I think most clubs and most deals we've seen are taking a pretty cautious approach to how they deal with agents' fees to family members.
And I think you're right. I think they're the two main risk factors. And let's just be clear for everyone listening. So the point around the payment to be treated as a benefit, most player will have a rep agreement with their agent, which will say, I will pay the agent typically 5% of gross annual salary. There'll then be an agency fee negotiated with a club. And historically, they used to say, well, that's 5% split 50-50 club and player. So the player is now been taxed on 2.5% of his salary when the rep agreement said he'd pay the agent 5%. And this is where HMRC came and said, well, we want tax on another 2.5%. So now we know that HMRC expect to see the player's benefit in kind be at least the 5% that it says in his rep agreement. The other one, the family members, the argument is if it's mom, dad, brother, sister representing the player, there's no way that individual is going to be doing anything other than looking after the player's best interest because they're family members. In a lot of cases, we've seen examples on both of those where HMRC's view can be valid, but we've also seen a few exceptions as well, haven't we? We've seen those risk factors have an impact on the market. How do you think it's changed behaviour?
When the guidance initially came out, we fielded quite a few calls from agents about how they deal with their rep agreements going forward. You know, whether they just reduce them all to 2.5% now and then carry on doing a deal at 5%, split 50-50. But what we've seen for our HMRC inquiries is them ask for the current rep agreement, but also the previous one. And if it's quite clear that the current rep agreement's been reduced, then HMRC would seek some sort of commercial justification for that isn't just trying to adhere to their agency fee policies. But I'd say generally how the behaviour's changed is, you know, each club has their ways of doing these things and they're not all aligned. But generally, I think a lot of the transfer negotiations now are using the player rep as kind of the basis of how the agent's fees are structured. So they're making sure that their 5% is met, or with their 6%, 10%, whatever it may be. And then the rest of the agent's fees built on top of that. So that is a risk factor that I think has been adhered to pretty well across the board now. Yeah.
Just because a risk factor is triggered on a specific transaction, does that mean it's necessarily an issue with HMRC? Does that mean you're going to be in trouble in years to come?
Not necessarily. It depends on the particular facts and circumstance of the case. Going back to the reducing the rep agreement example, if you've got a player that's on 10 grand a week and the agency rep agreement says 10%, that's not too unreasonable. But if the player's now going on to 100 grand a week and the player rep agreement's 10%, then that's a much bigger chunk of money. So there's a commercially viable reason there as to why you might reduce that to 5%, and even though that's triggered a risk factor, there's good backing for that reason. So I think we've seen that in practice, and you know, just because you've triggered a risk factor doesn't necessarily mean it's a slam dunk for HMRC.
And we had a family member case as well that's probably worth just running through, didn't we, with the dad?
Indeed, yeah. Another one where a dad was one of the agents working on a deal. Player was potentially leaving on a free, but you know, dad was part of the team that convinced him that staying at his current Premier League club was the place to be, which secured the club a pretty important asset for the next few years. Again, it was also one of those where HMRC initially stood down because they didn't have any evidence to the contrary. But again, they're looking into it again. But I think we've got a pretty decent argument there about the services that the dad has clearly provided to the club there. And it's not all player services.
Yeah, and look, on that case in particular, we know that the player services, as well as securing a good contract, were actually the player with young children wanted to stay in the city he was in. Yes. Him and his wife were settled there. But there was clearly value to the club in not having to replace a 40 or 50 million pound player for another 3 or 4 years. So I think last little piece before we close today, let's just think about what best practice is now, and what advice do you generally give to clubs and players or agents on a transfer?
Well, the overarching theme throughout the whole podcast and all of the guidance is documentation and evidence. That's been clear throughout the entire period. I think it's ever more important now in that, for example, if a player moved to the UK in summer 2024, first tax return for the 24-25 tax year is due to be submitted by January 26. HMRC have up to a year to inquire into that. So that's January 27. And you're probably not going to get into the meat of the inquiry until mid-2027, 3 years after the original transfer. And then you've got the issue of having to go back 3 years to find all your old evidence, your old emails, your old phone calls. You might have got a new phone, got rid of your WhatsApp, and try and find all that to back up your case. So that's quite a difficult spot to be in. So we certainly recommend keeping evidence documentation when the deal is done. And as part of that, as a firm, we've been doing some memos which help document that. So again, just sets out the facts of the transfer, who was interested, what services have been provided to player and club, what the scenario was, the current deal, the new deal proposed, all of that, and evidence, to that extent, which is to be agreed and signed by all parties, so the club, the agent, the player, such that they're all in agreement that the content of that memo is exactly how they thought the transfer negotiations went. We feel like that leaves us in 3 years' time with a pretty easy piece of paper or a pretty easy report that can say, this is how it was done, this is why, here you go. And we don't need to scramble around 3 years ago of emails to try and build our case when HMRC go after it.
Yeah, and the guidance is quite clear, referring to contemporaneous evidence, isn't it? So doing it at the time the deal's happened or just after the close of the window is definitely better than 3 years down the line, and puts us in a strong starting spot for us on when HMRC raise inquiries, I think.
I also think it gives you the ability to kind of set your precedent for any potential inquiry. So we've seen in the past on some inquiries whereby HMRC have found this one particular email trail, which looks pretty damning from a club services point. It's the agent, perhaps hammering the club purely on the player side. But actually, we know that a load of club side stuff's happened. We've just got no evidence. Yeah. Whereas I feel like actually doing this memo kind of sets you on the front foot with that, as opposed to having to argue away HMRC's evidence. You've got your own to kind of start on the front foot and be like, have a pretty strong case to start with.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, last question. One of the things we get asked by agents quite often, or told by agents quite often, we don't want any risk. We don't want any tax risk. Is it possible? Is it possible to remove the risk completely?
Never. And I don't think HMRC would ever want that either. The life of the football unit at HMRC would be very dull if there was no grey areas for them to dive into every year. Agents' fees might not be the hot topic at the moment, but I'm sure it will come back to life at some point. So
yeah, I agree with you. As I get older and slightly more distrusting of some of HMRC's inquiries, I just think those grey areas are helpful because it leaves more area for inquiry rather than having clear black and white rules. But there we go. Okay, so that's it. Just a reminder that in the glamorous world of football, tax is still important. And as ever, we should say this is a complex area, so you should always take professional advice, and ideally from us. That's all for this first episode of Tax in the Spotlight. Don't forget to subscribe, rate and review our show. And if you've got any questions on today's topic or to find out more about us, head to www.safri.com and drop us a line. Thank you for listening.